But we're going to get started right away with our first guest, and her name is Erin Crosby Eckstine, and she is a historical fiction author. She is setting the literary world on fire with her book. And as a matter of fact, I bought my own copy because guess what? This is historical fiction, which is my favorite genre. So once I find out there's a book out that's good, I get a lot of feedback about it. In fact, I saw it on somebody's favorite books today on social media, their favorite books for last year. They had this as one. So, Erin, welcome to Black Authors Matter TV.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
You're welcome. And I believe this is this your debut novel?
It is, yeah. This is my debut.
That's what I thought. And that's great that your debut has a little stamp on it, a seal that says Good Morning America Book Club. And
Yes,
that is not common. There's a seal right on there. Or well, it's
there
backwards.
is. I've been I've been so excited to get to be a part of the Morning America Book Club this past year. I got to do like the big announcement and everything when Junie came out last February, and it's just been such a cool experience to be in the book club with so many other like amazing authors. And it was nerve-wracking because I had to go on national news, and that is scary. Other than that, it's been such a cool experience, and I'm so glad that Junie got picked for that.
Okay, before we get into the book, tell us a little bit about what happens when your book is picked for the Good Morning America Book Club.
Oh, okay. So this is actually kind of wild, but you find out a year in advance. So all those big book clubs, you find out a year in
Oh,
advance if your book is picked for most of them. So
okay.
basically, I was like out living my life. I think I was like at a ceramics class and I got a call from my agent and she was like, "Hey, you need to get on the phone right now." And so I had to run home and I got on a call with someone who was head of publicity at Random House, which is where my book is published, who I'd yet to meet because it was still so early in my entire process of my book. And they told me, they were like, "Hey, you got picked for Good Morning America," which was incredible and, such a great experience. But it's also really funny because you find out a year in advance and then you have to keep it a secret for a year. So you're not allowed to tell anyone. You're supposed to tell as like few people as humanly possible in your life. Obviously, like I told my husband and I told my
But that
parents and like it's like that.
look, you
I'm
know,
like pretty certain my dad
that
told
would have
people
been
when he
totally
wasn't supposed
difficult.
to.
Yeah.
I like would put money on the fact that my dad, I think, probably said some stuff he wasn't supposed to, but I had to like really keep it on lock for like a year. Because yeah, you it's supposed to be a secret. It's wild. So I basically spent a year knowing that I was going to be going on Good Morning America, and not being
Oh,
able to say or do anything about it, and just being like, oh, in a year I have to go on national news.
that's
But
a long time to keep a big secret. The
it is.
same thing happens on reality shows
Yes, it is. It's like that too.
where where's the selection process and people get eliminated, but it's taped, so they can't tell anybody. They're not supposed to say anything.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a lot like that
It's on a
process.
reality show, and we, we still have not been able to tell anybody how he did on the show. We're still people have stopped asking because we just haven't been able to say anything.
Yeah, it's a real
Oh,
thing. I know, like, I've heard about, the show Love is Blind. I don't know if anybody else has watched Love is Blind, but on
yes,
Love is
I
Blind,
watched the first
these
season.
people get married and can't tell anyone for
Right.
like 18 months after they get married until the show airs. So they have to like
Oh,
hide that they're married. It's wild.
that is wild.
Yeah.
So, and so after you go on Good Morning America, and they make the announcement, are there any other like activities that happen, bookings or trips or anything else that goes on after the announcement, after the big announcement?
So generally what for me at least happened is I had before like the day of my announcement they aired a pre-taped interview that I did with Deborah Roberts, which was such a cool experience. So I did like a pre-taped Zoom interview with her. So on the day that my book came out, they aired that. And then a few days later, you go into the studio for your like actual sit down interview. So for me, the day of my interview, I'm lucky in the sense that I live in New York. So for me, at least I didn't have to travel excessively because I already live here.
Okay.
So I hopped in a car at like 5 o'clock in the morning and got whisked off to Times Square. And it was actually pretty cool. I think I was one of the last people to be interviewed in the Times Square studio before they moved studios. They're in a new studio now. So they whisk you off, they take you there, they tell you a little bit about stuff. You spend a bunch of time in hair and makeup, a whole bunch of time in makeup. And then once my makeup was done, they were like, okay, off you go. And they just like bring you on stage and, everything is like boom, 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 boom between all these segments. So right before me were like a bunch of like Boy Scouts. So I had like all of these kids who were right before me. And like, I think there were also puppies in there at one point. Like there's so much going on. And, they bring you in and your interview is only, my interview is maybe like 3 minutes. So you spend all this time kind of like getting yourself ready for this live experience. It's going to be this like quick little 3 minute thing. But what was super cool is that they put my book up on like the Jumbotron in Times Square, which I was like now saying that I got,
Oh, okay.
Jumbotron in Times Square, which is pretty cool. Having lived in New York as long as I have. So it was a really great experience. So that's generally your sort of most immediate stuff is you have this interview, and then after that you end up, you do a little bit of stuff on social media. I ended up doing like an Instagram live with Deborah Roberts a little bit after, and you kind of get into some things like that. Your book pops up at a lot of little free libraries around the country, which is pretty cool. And it just also ends up being just a really great way for a lot of readers to just discover your book in a way that they might not otherwise. So it's just a really great experience.
Well, they say that success is never an accident.
Mhm.
So I say all of that to say that this is your debut novel. And not only is this your debut novel, but you've been able to secure an agent, you have a major publishing house, and then you've been able to secure Good Morning America, um, the Good Morning America book club. So it seems that you were very intentional about how you wanted to go about getting your book published. So what was the thought process in just from concept to actually getting your book published? Because I'm sure none of this was an accident for you.
I think, thank you. I really appreciate that. It's a combination, my dad always loves to tell me the quote of the, it's like, like 90% of success is just showing up. My dad's a big fan of that quote. And I think, a lot of it with book success is to some extent been that. Junie is loosely based on a family story of mine, from my grandmother's side of the family in Alabama. I was born in Alabama, and my entire like maternal family is from Alabama. My grandmother had told me the story of my ancestor, my grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, who was enslaved in Lowndes County, Alabama. And there's this like, really elaborate family story that goes along with it. And I was really inspired by that story to write this, that story ended up evolving into Junie. And honestly, in terms of the representation part of it and all of that, initially, when I started the book, I really was just trying to, it was a project that I was excited about. It was something that I felt very connected to my family. I was like extremely close with my grandparents. And, my grandmother had always wanted to write a book and she'd never really gotten around to it. So in some ways, it felt like it was something I could do that was sort of like connected to what she wanted and our relationship and all these different things. So I initially in writing Junie really was just diving into it as like a hobby and something to do. I was a high school teacher. I was a full-time school teacher. And I started Junie very initially in a class that I took, a writing class that I took here in Brooklyn. I ended up meeting like a really amazing community of other writers through that, and we all sort of started supporting each other in our own sort of book growth and career. Interestingly, another one of the authors in that original group just published her debut this year too, which is pretty cool. Um, in terms of the agent and all of that, interestingly enough, that was something I kind of stumbled into. I ended up usually getting an agent is like a pretty regimented process. I ended up landing an agent via Twitter in 2020, which I would say is generally not the process. And I say I do not recommend to other people because agents don't generally like this, but I happened to come across a literary agent who was specifically looking for unagented Black writers online. And I happened to be the only person who answered. I just saw this and I was the only person who answered the message.
No,
So
great,
I
because sometimes
That's
we see
showing up.
people who do that. No, well, sometimes we'll see
Mm.
people who will say, I'm looking for such and such. And then we might see maybe 25 people will answer, but 24 of those people are not serious. But because we saw 25 people answer, we're like, well, they got who they wanted, so I'm not going to respond. But we didn't know that 24 of those people weren't serious. So we
exactly.
talked ourselves out of something. So it's good that you responded because you just never know.
That was really what it came down to. Exactly. I really just didn't know. And at the time, Junie wasn't finished. It was still a work in progress. I really was reaching out to this person more so for, frankly, like feedback than anything and just trying to kind of move this process along. And it ended up being that I connected with this incredible agent, Michelle Brower. Michelle ended up becoming my initial literary agent. And, she and I've been a part of her agency, since. So really that initial sort of like just kind of jumping in and I think taking that risk initially is really what has helped to lead me to the places where I am now. I think that for me, a lot of it is, I think that there's a lot to sort of like consistently doing the work of writing and creating your story and committing to do that thing, even if it is just doing small amounts here and there. I at that point in time, I'd probably been working on Junie for like 18 months, 2 years. At that point, in the background while I'm teaching, I had a full-time job that was very busy. I was doing a lot of stuff. But I just kind of kept at it here and there with what I had. And I think ultimately what a lot of it comes down to is I think just sort of diligently working at your little thing. And then when opportunities arise, trying to, take the risk of putting yourself out there a little bit, even if it is scary or you might get rejected or, all kinds of different things. I think that is ultimately a lot of where the sort of this path has, that was kind of what started me on this whole path.
Well, that's part of the showing up when you responded to that agent's tweet. That's, that's one of those things where it's almost like a miracle, but um, you just never know where your opportunity is going to come from.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
And I think
that's,
it's like there are a lot of, miracles like that out there, but I think a lot of, for a miracle to work, you kind of have to be ready
you
for the
have to,
miracle.
right, because it's about faith. Faith without works is dead. So you can have all the faith in the world, but if you don't have some action to go with it, then so you could sit and say, well, I really want to write a book, and then you never get on your laptop or whatever.
Yeah. It's like
you know
you gotta put the
so
words down at some
yeah,
point.
But
yeah, the book is
I
not going to
love
write itself.
I love what you said, Erin. If you want a miracle to happen, you have to be ready for the miracle because
Yeah.
Gwen, what if you think you're putting in the work, you're doing all of the writing, but you're not showing any progress. You're writing, but your writing hasn't gotten any better. You know what
Hmm.
I mean? So you still have to put in the work. You still have to put in the progress. You still have to start getting, get better, get that feedback. Like you said, you only reached out to this agent to get feedback to see if what you were doing was even on the right track. And it just wound up being that not only did you get feedback, but you got a book deal out of it.
Yeah, exactly. It just ended up being like a much better situation than I ever
And you could
anticipated.
imagine.
Exactly. And
Now,
I think, that's very much, the truth. And I think so much of it too, with writing in particular, is I think like learning to accept being bad. I think so many people are really, I also teach writing in addition to writing myself. And I think a lot of the writers I come across are so scared of not being good at writing and having to struggle through the process of not being very good. And the thing I always try to remind my students of is very much that like every single book that's ever landed on a shelf, that's ever anywhere, every book that you've ever loved was at one point like a really terrible first draft. Like every book is bad initially. All first drafts are usually sloppy and messy and confusing, and it takes people learning the skill of writing, editing, understanding their stories, getting feedback. It's a process. And I think what holds back so many people is that fear of like, oh, I'm not going to be good enough. I'm not good enough at this thing. Oh, this thing is terrible. But it's in reality, it's like everyone's kind of bad at it initially, certainly. And then pretty much always, every project kind of starts bad. it eventually comes together over years of time and effort and reading and, collaboration, all these different things. So I often think too, it's like learning to persevere a little bit through being bad is helpful.
Yeah, and
Um,
fear of rejection is a real thing.
very much so. Yeah, very much so. I often say I think the biggest thing that helped me overcome a lot of my fear of rejection. 'Cause I was for most of my life terrified to share my writing with anyone. I was, really, really nervous about it. I didn't want anyone to read the stuff I read really, even if I did, anything I wrote, I was generally hiding, not finishing, and really not sharing with anyone. And I often say that I think the thing that helped me overcome that more than anything was my first year of teaching. I taught sixth grade, my first year of teaching, and I came to the end of that school year and was like, if I could survive a year of teaching
The
these sixth
sixth
graders,
graders.
I don't know why I'm acting like I'm scared of other things. Like, if I could deal with the thing that I dealt with on a daily basis, for this year, why am I afraid to go sit with a bunch of other adults in a writing class? Like that is ridiculous. And I think sometimes that, at least for me, was a lot of what put it into perspective. I was like, I just spent a year dealing with children, like trying to light fires in my classroom. I really have to move. I gotta do this thing. This is nothing compared to that.
Love that.
Yeah.
Now, is Junie the name of the main character?
Yes. So
And
in
it was Junie a real person's name, or is that a name
Junie's
that was
Junie's a made up name. That is not the real character. So
okay?
in terms of the background for the story, that Junie focuses on a 16-year-old enslaved girl on a plantation in Alabama. She is grieving the recent loss of her sister, and she currently is in a situation on the plantation where she serves as maid to the plantation owner's daughter, who is about her same age, and they have grown up together and sort of have like a something akin to a friendship. Um, but in this situation, Junie is also her mate. So obviously this is a not exactly a friendship. Um, and at the same time, news comes in that there's a potential that Violet, the plantation owner's daughter, is going to be married off. And Junie comes to realize that because of her position as Violet's enslaved maid, that if Violet were to get married, Junie would be ripped away from her home and sent wherever Violet goes. So Junie ends up committing a desperate act that ends up rousing her sister's ghost from the grave by accident. And that leads Junie onto this sort of larger coming of age, loss of innocence kind of journey, unearthing a lot of the secrets of this plantation that she has, literally never left in her entire life. So that's really the arc of the story. Junie, like I said, is loosely based on a family story of mine. It's based on an ancestor of mine that we call my grandma Jane. So Jane became Junie.
Okay.
But my grandma Jane, without getting into extreme details, because some of them are spoilers for the book, my grandma Jane ended up becoming a founder of the town that my family still literally lives in Alabama. It's like a blink and you miss it town in Alabama, but she did. Um, she ended up becoming this, really incredible figure who really carved like a life for herself and ended up like becoming one of the sort of central figures in this initial all Black community in Alabama that like continues to exist in many ways. And a lot of her decisions and actions are what ultimately sort of like shaped the fortunes of her descendants, me, for century to come after. So a lot of that was what initially inspired the story. But what I often thought about was I wanted to focus on what we didn't really know about my ancestor, which is that we didn't really know anything about her time when she was enslaved. We had like no, as you know, that's like a big, historically, that's just like a wall. Like you just
Yeah.
really don't know what happened to people during that time. The fact that I can even frankly like pretty clearly trace an ancestor to like a time and a relative place is like pretty uncommon. So I think that I really use the historical fiction here to want to like explore, okay, well, like what was this person's life potentially like prior to what we do know about her? And in addition to that, add in some sprinkles of magical realism and some other themes that I was just like interested in.
Hmm. You know, just the storyline that you talked about is so reminiscent of so many families. It's sort of like African Americana, I'll
Hmm.
say. We all have some kind of story about a grandmother or great grandmother or great great grandmother or someone. On my mother's side, they were able to trace back to the last slave. So we can do 7 generations on that side.
Yeah.
They kept pretty good records and all of that. And they were having a family reunion for a long time, for 50 years. And then that next generation kind of let it fall off. But my dad's side, we get very little information. So it's just it varies from family to family. But the the bits and pieces that people get is like folklore,
Exactly.
about your
Yeah.
family, you
That's
know.
really what it ended up being, is a lot like it became more like folklore. And with these stories, my grandmother was very much like our family storyteller. She was really the person who maintained the family lore, is the way I like to describe it. She herself was like, I think a lot of the reason that I know this story happens to be because, this was my grandmother's this is a lot of generations back for me.
Mm-hmm.
But my grandmother was raised, I was in large part raised by my grandmother. My grandmother was raised by her grandmother, and then that grandmother was raised by this grandmother. So you can
Oh,
see there's like a
yeah.
long trajectory of interconnected grandmas.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, my grandmother knew all of her grandmother's stories. So it became this sort of way of maintaining things that my grandmother would routinely tell all of this family lore, whether it would be her own generation, the one before her, her grandma. Like she knew everything and just kind of kept this like constant storytelling, going on throughout my life. And so as a result, because she maintained so many of those stories, I was able to learn a lot about these times and I did not obviously live through. And my grandmother was such a passionate storyteller. My grandmother loved to read. My grandmother was also a teacher. And she and I were extremely close. And really was the person who I think more than anyone probably made me really love to read and like love books and really care about storytelling. And so I think in a large part, this whole book was very much connected to the relationship that I had to her and sort of that initial story that she told me, and as well as in so many ways, a lot of the other stories that sort of infiltrate into this and sort of the general folklore and the sort of like, picture of Alabama that often formed through her own stories, mixed with, of course, like my own conceptions of Alabama. I was born there and I lived there on and off till I was about 8. And my grandparents lived there until they passed away. So like I visited all the time.
Okay.
So this book is very much set in the region of Alabama where more or less the region of Alabama where I'm from. So it is quite like connected to my own sort of like family and family lore.
This is the
Oh,
importance of what I call sitting at our ancestors' feet. So I've always said that I would love to sit. I've always loved sitting at my mother's feet, at my grandmother's feet, at my great aunt's feet, and listening
mhm.
to those stories. And there are certain stories that because I sat and listened, I'm one of the few people in the family who knows certain stories.
Exactly. Yeah.
And because you sat and you didn't just sit there like, oh, I got to hear this again, actually sat and listened, you were able to carry those stories over, and now you're able to encapsulate them into this book.
Exactly.
So I hope that more young people are taking these stories and holding them in their hearts, and they're taking the times that they have with their elders and actually valuing those times because those moments are not going to last forever.
Yeah, they certainly do not last forever. And I do think that it is very important to, yeah, to value them. And I think my grandmother herself also sat, like I said, she really sat with the stories of her elders. She often said, she used to tell me that like part of the reason that she knew so many family stories, honestly, because she was just eavesdropping on people. Her bedroom when she was a kid was off the kitchen. And she told me her bedroom was off the kitchen, so she used to pretend to be asleep, but would really
Yeah.
just be listening to all the adults talking. My grandmother was a trip her whole life, but she one of her favorite things to do was she would just sit up pretending to be asleep and would just eavesdrop on people. And so she knew all of the stories because she was just listening to stuff she didn't have any business listening to.
That's
Um, and that was what she pretty much was doing. So a lot of family stories she knew because she was doing that. But I think that was also part of it, that she was, she was really interested in hearing all of the stories and the storytelling and knowing all the information, and then also cared about maintaining it her whole life. My grandma's memory didn't never slipped, so she knew all that stuff like that forever. And that was, yeah.
Well, thank you for letting us know about the story, Junie. And as I said, I have my copy. I haven't read it yet because my to be read shelf is really, really overwhelming.
As
But
is mine, I
I will
understand.
get to it. It is on my list to get to, and it's available wherever books are sold. Is the
It is.
paperback coming out soon?
Yes, the paperback comes out next month.
Okay,
So
that's what I thought.
in
Normally
one
it's a
month from
year later.
today, you can get the
Okay.
paperback. So if you do not want to lug around a heavy hardcover, wait a month.
Okay. Paperback. All right. Well, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. Congratulations
Thank
on
you
the
so much for
success.
having me. This was such a great time.
Yeah,
Well,
your
thank you for
debut
being
novel. This
here.
is
Best
amazing.
wishes to you.
Yes, to you too. Happy New Year. Bye.
Bye
Bye bye.
bye.